Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us, and thanks to all those on the live stream that are joining us as well. As said, I'm Shane Peros from Google. I lead the global broadcast, media, entertainment, and distribution verticals. And today we've assembled this panel to talk about this transition between linear and digital. And we at Google believe that we're in this transitional period, or middle ground, if you will, and that we'll be in this period for quite some time. So the tricky situation that we find ourselves in is, how do we build for the future, in this digital IP future, while still building and supporting the businesses that we have today, while also setting up a seamless transition when this shift to digital happens? And we at Google are investing incredible amounts in content distribution platforms, connecting viewers to those content, seamless monetization and flexible monetization, so there's a fair value exchange between the end user and the content provider. And the underpinning of all that is our cloud technology that allows you to aggregate and visualize your data and then apply machine learning to really accelerate your business. But today it's not about Google. It's really about giving back to the audience about how are we going to get through this transition from linear to digital. So we've assembled these industry leaders and thought leaders here, which we're very excited about. And they're going to give us their insights on how they're planning for it, how they're building for it, and how they're going to get to this seamless transition. So without further ado, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and give us just a minute on what they're responsible for at their companies. And John, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Shane. My name's John Honeycutt. I'm the CTO of Discovery Communications, parent of Discovery Channel, Eurosport, and several other well-known worldwide brands. My role as CTO is to lead our consolidated broadcast and IT infrastructure operating in kind of a CTO, CIO role. So what that means is really everything from the cameras we use to produce some of our content or all of our content, all the way through every email that gets sent in our company, including information security, data, and all the business systems that surround that.
Hi, I'm Joe Inzerillo. I'm Executive Vice President and CTO for BAMTech and Special Advisor to Major League Baseball. So for those of you who don't know what BAMTech is, we're a spin-out from Major League Baseball Advanced Media. Last August, we carved out the company that really was our streaming arm of what we did, direct-to-consumer products, things like that, and the Walt Disney Company invested $1 billion in that entity to really go forward and continue to do what we were doing and really build the next generation platform for really television, as the market is moving. And so I oversee all the technology, the development, client side, server side, all that kind of fun stuff. And, excited to be here and have some good conversation.
Great.
I'm Dave Klein. I'm the CIO and CTO for Viacom, which is Paramount Pictures, BET, MTV, Comedy Central across the globe. I'm responsible for pretty much all the technology stack, whether it's the traditional broadcast side, the distribution production side, or it's the traditional IT side, as John said, from email through applications. On the multi-platform side, we also have the engineering. So whether it's building of a player, with those components parts for ad sales decisioning or SEO, the rest of it, as well as a product team that's associated to that for those individual components.
I'm Vikram Somaya. I'm the Global Data Officer for ESPN. It's a small sports media company out of Connecticut. I am focused on primarily delivering advanced advertising solutions across all of our platforms for our ad sales business and with our distribution business. And I'm also responsible for all of our ad platforms across the organization.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. So let's dive in. As I stated, TV is arguably in the largest transition in the history of TV. And Joe, why don't we start with you on this as the streaming leader and the global streaming leader. But given that we're in this transition, how long do you think it's going to take to get to the new normal, and why?
Well, I'm not so sure there'll ever be a new normal when you get right down to it. I mean, we've always had transitions in the industry, the communications industry, if you will. But radio didn't go away. It's still around. Television's not going to go away the way that we think about it. Won't go away. It'll still be there. But what we've seen is the pace of change is accelerating. And so I think that the new normal is change. And so it'll take a while, especially when we start talking about monetization and things like that. These business models have been in place for a long time. And so that's the part that's harder. The technology side of it, I think, is outstripping the business models in many cases here. But it's going to be, we're going to be in this a little bit amorphous area of every media company really having to make some uncomfortable transitions from sort of one methodology of monetization and dealing with customers to another method, at least an additive method of dealing with customers, direct to consumer and things like that. And so it's going to be a while, and I think it's not going to end.
Yeah.
Continue to iterate.
Yeah, does anybody have a timeline? Does anybody want to put a timeline on some of the shift at all?
Well, like with us, I'm pushing heavily by 2020 to again, be across the globe with 2 technology centers, the cloud, consolidation of those, what do you want to call them, monolithic linear systems and multi-platform systems and gluing them together. So around ad sales, content, and the rest. But I agree with Joe, it's a constant iteration. I don't think it's going to stop. I think things like IoT and IoE and VR and AR and all these other great things that are coming out are going to continue to proliferate, and we're going to continue to hopefully take advantage of disruption in a good way.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think people talked about OTT and that taking away from linear and things like that. And Joe, you've been quoted as saying it's complementary. We agree, and I agree. Are there other things, and this could be for anybody here, are there other things that we should keep an eye on over this transition period, whether that is subscription versus advertising models or IP, or what are the other things you think are hot?
Well, I think I'd say, first of all, walking around here the last couple of days, I don't think this transition is a technology problem. I think there is plenty of technology that is fully capable of doing what we need to do to move to an all IP future. I think 2-3 years ago we were here kind of worried about encoding, and we were worried about kind of the infrastructure components of it, how we were going to move these streams around. I think all of that, as Joe's business has proven, is fully capable today. I think the real question is about data and how it gets driven. If you go up the stack, so to speak, into the business systems that we've used to run, Discovery is a now 30-plus-year-old business. Those are not multi-platform business systems, to say the least. And I think that is probably the biggest issue that the industry faces, is our ability to drive all of this capability from a unified and organized data set. Some of that is, frankly, on us as content owners and how we've historically organized our data. But I think some of it is also just a challenging moment in the capability set of some of those tools that we've historically used.
Yeah. Let me speak from the end of the road, too. I think disruption sucks if you're not the disruptor, right? And frankly, our businesses have done particularly well with a model that a lot of us understood pretty well. And I came from outside the business a little bit, so it's been fun to come and rip shit up and see how it works out, right?
How is it working out?
We're doing all right. And so part of it is all of the things that we just talked about in terms of building infrastructure. In some cases, those rules don't apply anymore because FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, have done a good job of turning some of those rules up on their heads, right? And from our point of view, we have to figure out which pieces we want to take, which pieces we want to buy, which pieces we want to partner with.
Yeah.
And that is a really interesting road, getting only more interesting as change becomes our new normal.
Yeah, and culture is a big piece too. You have to make sure, like if you use machine learning or AI or other aspects of things that can make you more efficient, you're not alienating the content creators or the ad sales developers of packages. Yeah. You just have to be careful in how you introduce those things more effectively and intelligently.
No, great. So let's move on a little bit. So now we've discussed kind of the timeline of what that shift looks like. Let's talk a little bit about your business, because you all made significant investments in your business and the infrastructure that runs your business today. And whether that's sales management, trafficking, coding, whatever it might be. So David, let's start with you on this one. We've talked a lot about this, but what technologies are you going to stand up now for this middle ground, and how are you thinking about those being transferable or not?
So with us, a lot of times you'll hear the word orchestration in between a couple of things. We're focusing on how today we can orchestrate those various components I mentioned, the traditional IT piece and then broadcast and multi-platform, which do operate very differently. One is very much iteration and fail fast and agile, and one is hardened. And then you get in between the IT side, trying to use some of your words. But with that, we're focusing very heavily on the content stack, making sure that we have good taxonomy around the content. We know what we're doing with the content, whether it's ingesting it for machine learning or it's being able to tag it so that I can get proper data coming back. And then figuring out from an ancillary perspective that ad sales component or that component around marketing or components around the next thing we're going to create with it, short form or long form, and how it's going to play in that space. So from a tech stack for us very specifically, ad sales, content, huge, but those ancillary systems are as important. They have to keep up. Your SAP systems, for instance, with us, it's a financial system. Everything starts and ends there. Or things around research systems and data associated to that. It's very important to make sure that you're keeping up with those things, but also keeping up with the tagging and how they come back, because it's all playing into space. The physical content with all those ancillary things, including that data, that metadata. It's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing that's interesting is everything that we've sort of talked about this from an infrastructure standpoint. I mean, this is a really interesting show. It was my 25th NAB. And like, I think back to like when I first came here, it used to be that infrastructure was this huge asset. Right. It was like, we have this, I got this physical plan. It's amazing. This is what's empowering my business.
Box.
Yeah, like this thing is sweet. You see all the BNCs on that thing? And that's the way it used to be. And now it's like, at some level, existential level, infrastructure is actually the enemy. Like it's a boat anchor. It's the thing that is not malleable in the new world. And so I think the way that you think about what is infrastructure is really much more, not just software defined, but it's really people. It's folks that can write code. It's people that can make your will come to life. And it's a very different thing than sort of racking and stacking servers. And so I think on one hand you have that transition that's happening, but the other transition, I think for a lot of folks, is this transition of direct to consumer. Because most of the content brands, if we look at Major League Baseball, in the old world, 20 years ago, there was many layers of disintermediation between us and our fans. And so, we knew kind of directionally what ratings were. We knew by panel, and sampling kind of what things were going. But that's a very different conversation than having a one-on-one dialogue with an individual who has likes and wants and choice. Enormous amounts of choice that they didn't have in the past. And I think those two things are also like a real part of the equation about how you think about what it is that you're building. And the data, the data about what you're doing is incredibly important, but the data about those users is invaluable. And it informs all sorts of decisions. And as we were saying, Fang, I like the Fang. Those guys they're not playing by these rules. So they're going to take every asset and the value that they can extract from that to make really good decisions. And so you don't really want to be playing that game if you're choosing not to innovate in those other two areas that I was talking about too, or you're really just going into a stacked deck.
Yeah. Well, those are some great points. And you start to think about kind of fundamentally it's changing not only how you think about it from a technology standpoint, but even sales, right? Because the stuff that you're talking about and taking those layers out between you and the consumer with direct to consumer and things like that, it's a different sales game, right? So without getting too deep into the sales process, I'm just wondering at a high level, Vikram, for you, because you've been on multiple sides of the business, how are you setting up the sales teams at a high level? Are they two different teams or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll answer it a slightly different way. First of all, Fang was by Shelley Palmer, so I'm not going to take credit for that. But awesome.
Oh, you gave Shelley a plug?
I did. I was talking to 15 of our CMO clients, and the primary topics we were discussing were identity, addressability, measurement, and automation. Like things we would not have been talking about 3 years ago, 5 years ago at all, right? And there were a bunch of sales leaders in the room who understood that, understood how to have a conversation about it, understood how to have a more consultative sales approach than historically, where media in a lot of cases was transactional in a lot of senses. So does every sales team, does every sales player have the ability to do that? No. Do we have to figure out how to manage the right talent in, how to groom the right talent within the organization? Yes. Do we have to train? Do we have to bring in new, fresh blood so that we can understand what needs to be updated, what needs to be modernized, what needs to be... None of this is necessarily a new thing, but the pace of change, again, makes it so that that talent equation is becoming absolutely key. And understanding how to have a sales team that is pivoting for this, that's the foundation. Everything else becomes gravy.
Yeah, and I want to talk about talent towards the end, but I want to talk to something that obviously sales is a driver and talk about revenue. Really, when we think about that for a minute, you're effectively, if you think about a global basis, from an advertising revenue perspective, you're effectively moving around $220+ billion in revenue, and here in the U.S., 70 to 80 billion, depending on the numbers you're looking at. And John, why don't we go to you on this? What's your vision of how TV will be bought and sold in the future?
Well, I think first of all, to pick up a little what Vikram was saying, I've never wanted a sales team to be more creative than this moment, right? I think the creativity of salespeople in this environment is critical. And our ability to take that creativity and turn it into a consumer experience I think is really a key tenet, whether that's branded entertainment, whether that's experiences that extend a piece of content to mobile or online or whatever it is. I think that relationship between kind of production, technology, and selling with a creative arc over that is massively important. I think that television for the foreseeable future will be sold probably in three ways. It'll be sold increasingly in certain day parts and for certain types of content programmatically. I think that is something that has to come within our industry because it is efficient and it unlocks all of the things that the other guys have been saying up here about that relationship with the consumer. There is a pretty big danger in that, right? That becomes a race to the bottom from a pricing perspective. So we have to be very careful. So that's one. I think two, and maybe I'll go to the other end. I think there will continue to be sales in television that are akin to, just say it, Mad Men style selling. There's a deal that occurs based upon a brand, based upon someone wanting to have their content associated with a certain experience. You have to continue to prove that. So that's maybe the other end. And I think in the middle, there's this emerging concept about optimization of the audience within a linear schedule. So what do I mean by that? That's targeting of segments. It's not truly programmatic, but it's targeting of segment. It's knowing that there's a high propensity of whatever beer drinkers within this show. So therefore, there's an arrangement that can get made to do that. So I think it'll be multiple ways, and I'm sure there's a few more, but those three primaries in my mind are probably where it goes. It's a programmatic experience, it's a branded or a relationship experience on the other end, and then there's this increasing maybe middle ground between those two about an optimized environment with the technology that we have today.
That's interesting. So when we think about this, obviously the digital capabilities give you a lot more to really execute on just what you were talking about, John. And Vikram, why don't we go back to you for a minute on this? And I'd love to hear from everybody quickly on it. But will this shift create opportunities for it to be additive in revenue? Will it remain flat? Will there be challenges? I think you're right, John, when you're talking about we have to be very careful about how we enter into this so we don't go in the other direction.
I think there will be winners and losers in this for sure. And I think there'll be a change in the guard in a lot of ways. I think those who are quick to adapt to understanding, certainly on the ad sales side, how advertisers are now looking for outcomes across all of their platforms. They're looking to understand video, right? Because that's how consumers are consuming it, whether it's on their phone or their tablet or their big screen, they're consuming it seamlessly. So they're looking for us to give them solutions that allow them to sort of connect to those pieces. Call it digital, call it linear, call it whatever you want in between. Right? Give me a solution that allows me to talk to my users, my consumers, my fans in a way that makes sense to me. And I think the people who can figure that concept out, the people who can have those conversations the right way are going to get the right money. Do I think it's additive? I think, again, thinking about outcomes and thinking about how marketers are thinking about that, overall, those who can figure out what that confluence looks like and are able to build the technologies around it fast enough to access that, train their sales staff, and actually speak to the market in the right way will win.
That's great.
Convergence and currency. So currency is a big deal on this, no matter what we do. And then how things converge and how it's looked at. And going back to even the sales staff, there's digital sales staff, there's linear sales staff, they come together, but how do you enable them to see things and work in a converged environment when the technology isn't truly converged? Whether it's your DFP product or the freewheel product or a traditional linear system. The data has to be mashed together in some data lake, and many times it doesn't have the same currency, it has different relationship values. How do you look at that more effectively to do the three things that John was chatting about? Enable those things to be from the ground up more native.
You can't leave this topic though without talking about measurement.
Yeah, well, that's why I said currency. So
you just can't. I mean, you got to say the word, Dave. So
Yeah, you got to
say the word. I mean, it's look up, whatever, write it down, tweet me. It's a disaster. I mean, it honestly is. I mean, some of the, I won't name names, but they might have been in that acronym that Shelley used about overstatement of video views. Hey man, if I did that, if a classic linear business, had an issue like that, I think there'd be a very different market reaction to what the reaction was to some of that news. It's a very complicated thing. The data is is, to quote, I guess, David Abraham from Channel 4 in the UK, data being the new oil. I mean, it's very important, but the problem is that, you know, there's a lot of it, and how it lines up, and to Dave's point, it's really difficult. And getting to it, you know, some of us are more direct. You know, my classic business, Dave's classic business, sitting behind a relationship, Vikram, you guys as well, to some extent, sitting behind, you know, a relationship with an MVPD that maybe doesn't want to give that up so freely or wants to negotiate for the value of that. That gets hard to try to do that. So I think, you know, measurement through all of what was set up here is probably, in my opinion at least, the most critical component of what the new advertising paradigm looks like.
But that's what we get OpenAP.
Yeah.
I want to go back, I think, to something that Vikram said and just talk about it, because I think, you know, this concept of winners and losers is really important. And I think that people sometimes don't really fully grasp, you know, that picture of the fact that, like, there's a lot of people that aren't going to survive this transition. Just like there was a lot of folks that were like the preeminent, you know, folks in radio that didn't survive the transition. Magazines, you know, on down the line. But, you know, part of it is our own making. It's the construct that we have where, if you think about it, if you're a traditional content provider, there were really only two ways that you could really move the revenue number. I mean, the advertising number, you know, getting a hit show or something like that obviously would move at some level, but the big moves were either get yourself in a different cable tier, like move up cable tier, so you go from 50 million to 80 million homes, or launch another channel and bolt on another channel. And so we do have an oversaturation, I would say, of stuff in the kind of linear ecosystem that there's just too much of. And you just have to look at the repetitions, like the number of repeats that there are, the number of like, you know, really programming wheels that are really only 8 hours long that just get repeated 3 times a day, to understand the fact that the market's oversaturated from a supply standpoint. And so there will be a course correction on the supply side for sure, because not everybody will be able to make that transition. And some of the measurement issues that we were just talking about are a great example of some of those folks were able to survive because of the imprecision of measurement.
Correct.
And now when you really know, okay, this is exactly who's watching this show, this is what the demo is, there's going to be some folks that don't look as attractive. Conversely, there'll be some other folks that way over-index, that maybe got muffled in the noise of that measurement system, that all of a sudden are going to come back and say, well, you know, these guys are actually really unique. Maybe it's not the biggest audience in the world, but it's the audience that I want as an advertiser to talk to. And so I think that's another big part of it, is not pretending that it's going to be okay for everybody.
The purity of audience is a really, I mean, Vikram, you'll know this better than anybody, is a really important thing right now.
Yeah.
So let's talk, we agree measurement's an issue, and it's something that has to be solved for. And I think, Joe, even to your points, with this content, year in and year out, we're breaking records for how much content's produced, right? Every single year. So there has to be a little bit of a course correct there. I agree with you. But since you brought up data and you guys are talking about data, let's pivot to that, because obviously we all want a better understanding of our audiences, right? And a lot of the technology that we can get our hands on today is going to provide for that. And you know, Vikram, why don't we start with you, because there's a couple different ways to look at data, and I want to start with, how are each of you using data to reinvent the TV experience for your viewers?
Yeah, I'll quote George Orwell, you know, all data is equal, but some data is more equal than others, right? Again, going back to the things on the commercial side, these notions of identity, understanding who we're talking to, understanding how we can personalize discovery experiences for them, curating experiences for them, all of those experiential pieces and the commercial pieces, which really are interlocked, are the ways data is being used in the most sort of powerful ways. The other two, though, understanding addressability, using our systems the right way to take viewing information and actually feed back into those recommendation loops, again, notions of how to give them what they really want is important. The third goes back to what we've been discussing, which is measurement, right? How do we actually measure what people are actually doing, and is it useful? Right? We've been using currencies for a long time based on surveys, based on statistics. Now we know in some cases exactly what people are doing. What do we do with that overabundance of information, right? And how do we take that to our marketers in a way that makes sense? So those are some of the big pools, I feel like, of things that we're working with now. The one that's a little bit ignored a little bit is the creative side, especially for folks like us who want to be creative, who are finding ways to make technology creative, who are trying to tell narratives in interesting ways using the tools that we have. We now get to work with folks who create content, folks who create advertising in ways that we've never been able to do before. And that leads to a whole bunch of information as well for them, the creatives, as well as for us. And that, unfortunately, is a hard one to scale. All the other ones I just named have easily scalable methodologies. That last one is more ephemeral.
So, David, why don't we shift over to you? Obviously, you guys have done a lot with data around Vantage and the other programs that you've recently talked about too. How are you guys thinking about data, not just for the TV experience, but also for growing revenue and taking that and making it additive?
So, again, with us, as you mentioned, Vantage, or even the OpenAP announcement that came out recently, we've been very heavily trying to figure out how to look at the market more effectively, to really work with both the agencies, but also work directly with the clients that we've got. In general, though, ad sales, I think we've been spending a lot of time on, and I agree with the content creation aspect of things. We've been trying very heavily to try to figure out how I use machine learning as an example to ingest content. And then what can I do after I ingest the content to take that data and do something bigger and more appropriate for a user value, so that a user might be able to go out and not worry about just what I'm looking at, why I'm looking at it, but have a great experience based on machine learning and really taking a deeper dive, not just on recommendation and personalization, but really understanding what's inside that content. And then how do I help my ad sales guys and marketing guys really use it more effectively? We have DMPs and we've got our data lake, and we've got all this amount of data, but sometimes it's disconnected in some of the areas, especially around content, because content's an evolving thing, and as I mentioned earlier with culture, you just have to make sure you're not alienating the content creator, because that's the worst thing you can do. These are supposed to be additive tools, but they're still new to the world, and when you ingest the content, you start coming up with decisioning even for building a film or distributing a film. It could tend to cause some problems but that's what I do. Why are you throwing technology at me? It's more explaining it, trying to show the art of the possible. What could you do with this data and why you're collecting it? Not just collecting it for the hell of collecting it.
Yeah. I think, when I think about it, I think that there's this, there's almost a fetishizing of like this notion that the computer is going to solve all these problems. Like once we get into the computer, then it's like there's a do my job button and it just sort of works, right? And I think the data is an interesting example of, good data is good. Bad data is not so good. And so I think that it's important to take a step back and realize that computers are really, really good at optimization. That's like one of the best things, like teaching a computer how to optimize things with machine learning and whatnot, that they're good at. They're not disruptors. Computers don't come up, at least today, with disruptive ideas. And so part of it is like listening to the data sometimes and not others, because optimizing it, figuring out your market, sort of moving things around is there. But at the end of the day, all of us, no matter what we do, are in the business of entertainment. And entertainment's an emotional, visceral, human reaction. You need to move people. And sometimes that's not giving them what they want. It's giving them something, where there's a serial episode and somebody dies in it, and it's a very popular character, but that's part of the drama of it. And you need to sort of create that. And so I think there is a danger on too much data of this notion that we wind up gravitating towards the mean of just vanilla. And I think that opens up the possibility for disruptors. I mean, if you one of our partners, if you look at Game of Thrones with HBO, there's no way that comes out of the brain of a computer. It's like, the massive computer is like, what we need? We need like a incredibly violent, lots of sex scenes movie about dragons. That's what we need. Like the computer wouldn't tell you that for anything. But now you can see that, okay, well, they set the pace, and now there's a lot of things that are influenced by it. That it's entered the vernacular, and there's shows that don't necessarily copy it, but are certainly influenced by like, okay, well, I guess there is a market for this gritty, sort of very realistic, very like nobody's safe in this show type thing. But that didn't come from data. That came from people. So it's the instrumentation around it that is really important. But to expect that it's just going to drive decisions in totality, I think, is a mistake.
Correct. And also the, again, going past just the content, the tagging. So the research tagging, when you're tagging things, if they're not tagged properly, you're going to get incorrect data back,
right,
which will lead to a poor decision. So that tagging has to be kept up to date, and that's something that's also a very difficult, time-consuming thing to do.
But I think the creatives would admit that allowing data to become part of the way that they create things allow them to create greater, more watched things.
Sure.
And all creators love to be watched, right? We all know that. So if that enables them to build something that has all of the creative juices of something that only something in this generation is, look, this is the golden age of storytelling in so many ways, right? And data allows that to happen in ways that they would never have imagined even 5 years ago in some cases. That's only going to get more interesting for them.
So what's the ultimate data set, though? Because I agree with you, Joe, not all data is equal. And I've heard a lot about people wanting to utilize set-top box data, and is it in a usable format, is it not, and all these things. So What is the ultimate data set that you guys want, even now, going into the future, but right now?
The ultimate, is probably going to look, if you guys can answer that, I'm going to buy stock and all of that, and I'll be good. But I think that there's probably components of it, right? I think there's clearly, yes, past performance data. I think that there is, there's a social element to it, what people are interested in, what is going on online. You can go right through the spectrum, and there's probably elements of almost really everything you can think of. Some of the mechanical things we use, credit card purchase data. One of the bigger debates we have is, should we ingest the Twitter fire hose, yes or no? And what is that going to do for you, right? And how are you going to parse that? And what are you looking for? So I think that there's elements across the board, some of it being, past history, some of it being sort of financial, transactional, what people are buying for advertising, some of it what's in the zeitgeist. I think there's ingredients in all of that and how you do it. I said before, it's not about the technology, but this is an area where the technology is helpful if you can understand how to parse it, and if you can understand how to organize it in such a way that it can be valuable to you. We think a lot about that, given just the scale of our business. I mean, we're in 220 countries. Think about how many data sets we could get from 220 countries. What's important? How do you filter that up front is probably the single largest question. On one hand, I have people tell me all the time, well, give me everything because then I can figure it out. I think that's a really interesting statement. I'm not sure of the feasibility of that, right now. And look, some of this data you have to pay for. Yeah. So that there's a whole other thing there on transactional components of what you want to spend to be able to do that.
Yeah. I always try to think of stupid analogies, right? So imagine, I think of us sometimes as being in the car industry 100 years ago, right? There's a couple hundred car companies, and you could get under your hood, and you could mess with your stuff, and it'd help you to know how the car ran. And now you look around, and design is suddenly the most important thing, because honestly, you can't go under the hood anymore. Like, you have to go under the hood with 3 computers and a guy, and you have to hook it up to something, and even then, you want to understand what's going on. So to some degree, like, we're still figuring out how to access our distributed brain, right? Both the consumers are doing that because they're realizing they can do it, and we're doing that because we're realizing we still have to handcraft things a lot. And I think some of those things will become modular in ways, right? And we'll get to build on top of that. And as we do that, that's when it's going to get really interesting for us. I don't necessarily know that it'll be easy or that the change will stop or new ways to access media won't come out all the time. But I think data will become part of the way we do business rather than saying, what do we do with data? It's in everything, right?
To answer your question directly, the way that I think about it is there is sort of an ultimate data set, I think, in some respects, in the sense of it's where the person on the other side of this equation feels that the equation's balanced and they're bought into it. Yeah. And so it's like, I'm going to give you information about me.
It's valuable.
Yeah, because
it's I see
exchange,
that,
right? Like a fair value exchange. But it's one of those things. Like a friend of mine was doing a startup and he sent me a link. Hey, you should check this out. And it was like a local band type thing. Like, so it told you when concerts were in town. And it was one of those things. It was my friend. So normally I'm somewhat leery of some of those types of things. But it's like, okay, well, click here and give it access to your iTunes library. So it goes through and it sees the music that you have, and all of a sudden, it's pretty darn good at giving me recommendations about shows that are coming to town that I may want to go see. And that, to me, is that is the value exchange. Like, I gave them access to a lot of deeply personal information, like what kind of music I like, and what kind of music's carried through my life when you really think about it. It's like people's lives are somewhat of an amalgam of the music that they listen to the whole time. So there's a lot of really interesting inferences that you can make from it. But the value I got out of it was I go to see a lot more shows than I did, a year ago. And it's not because I didn't want to go, it's because I just didn't even know about it. And so I think the more that we on this side, from the producer standpoint, gets more into being able to demystify that data exchange and avoid doing super creepy things that would make people leery of it, the more we're going to get into the situation where you really do get this fair exchange of value, and then that's the stuff that's like gold, because there's no lying. It's truth. It's like, this is what I want. And I'm willing to give it to you because you're going to provide for me the thing I'm interested in.
I'll just say one thing. There is regulatory friction in this too.
Yeah, of course.
Where watching all of what's happening, just given the scale of, frankly, all of our businesses, in Europe and other places, where it's a very different situation than it is in the United States about moving data around and what's allowed and what's not allowed. So, it's not all free and easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this conversation would be different if you had it in France versus UK, right?
Yeah,
Versus
very
Japan.
much
So I think
Very much
so I think it's interesting, not just data, but the whole piece, even the infrastructure stuff,
Totally.
right? All right, last question, and I often think this gets overlooked, but you guys are, interestingly enough, you've all mentioned it, and we think a lot about it, and I've talked to all of you guys about it, but when you think about the skill sets needed to accomplish your visions on this future of TV, and maybe David, we can just start with you because you've mentioned it quite a bit. What are your people and talent strategies that you're developing to deliver on these future goals?
So, again, from my world, I'm very much trying to make sure that everybody has empathy for each other. So going back to the broadcast side to digital media. At times, you think they're in two different countries, two different worlds, because they do things so differently, or even traditional IT. I basically insist that they learn each other's world. You don't have to be an expert in the world, but you have to have an empathy and an understanding of it. And then also have a clear definition of where we want to take it from that converged area. Not everything needs to converge. There are things that can stay just the way they are, and they're going to run beautifully to the end of time. But in other areas, I don't believe you can be successful if you don't really push your organization to really culturally shift and have some thought process around, I'm not just going to tell you you're doing it wrong because I don't really know what you're doing. So that hardened broadcast to that iteration of multi-platform, or the glue in the middle in some cases, which is, if you want to call it traditional IT, virtualization or other things that have been around for decades that have been happening in that space. So for me, it's very much really taking stock in what you're doing, having a strategy, and making sure that people have empathy for each other. It's the only way to build it, and do it with a culture of, you're not losing something, you're gaining something. So when you go from on-prem to the cloud, why are you doing it? And really take people along for those who can go along with it, because some people can't. They're not equipped to do that. They need to have something they physically touch and hold every day. So being able to weed that out and make sure you're doing it properly.
Also sounds like maybe a lot of training of your current staff to cross-train them to be ready for that future.
Absolutely. And again, technology is changing dramatically every day. And today it's smartphones, tomorrow it might be embedded in your brain, who knows? But when that comes, you got to be able to figure out how you're going to grapple with it and accept the change.
Yeah, but you can't force training.
Right.
To Dave's point, I think you gotta make it available to people and see kind of who can embrace that mindset shift and who can't. It's really hard. I think it's increasingly difficult to find people who can left brain, right brain in these worlds, or think in the middle. And in the end, I say to my team all the time, I just want to work with good people. I want to work with people who have natural curiosity for how these things work and are interested. We had a story about moving some of our stuff to the cloud, and we had a bunch of nervous traditional IT engineers, and they said, well, it's not going to be on-prem anymore. What does that mean? And one of my guys said to him, when's the last time you physically walked into the data center and rebooted a server? And they all went, oh, good point. It's all on the other end of a mouse regardless at this point, and for a lot of operations. So I think people who can embrace that mindset and are naturally inquisitive and putting that opportunity in front of them is a pretty decent recipe to grow and retain staff.
I've always found it ironic that people that would consider themselves technologists would also say that they're averse to change.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, you can't really be a technologist and be averse to change. The reality is there's a lot of folks that aren't technologists, and I think there's a little bit of this game of not pretending everybody's going to win. The right people, I think, in general will, because they will elect to change. They'll elect to be malleable in their thinking, and they'll embrace it. And it's not forced training. They want it. They're thirsting for it.
Right.
I think the other side of that, though, is it's really understanding your company and your culture within that company. Because a lot of people, it's often like, how do we recruit these things that we need? We need these people that have this skill. How do we get them? Really, what companies should wind up doing is taking a really hard look at themselves and figure out, how do I make a company that's where these people want to be? And you can't just hire your way out of technical debt, and you can't hire your way out of sort of closed-minded thinking about this stuff. So you have to be, as an organization, willing to create an environment that people want to be in. And if it's the right environment for the right people, you're going to do well. But trying to get the right people in the wrong environment is not going to, makes it
That hasn't
worse.
worked for 100 years.
Right, it's exactly right.
And I think, it's a lot of Jenga, right? I mean, my own career, I've been I would call myself most likely to not succeed in data or technology, because none of the stuff I did in college or right after that had anything to do with what I do now. But it became about the things that you just cited, which is if you're curious, if you know how to navigate the kinds of companies you work with, if you know how to speak articulately about the things that you care about and the projects that you work on, all of these things don't necessarily sound as glorious as perhaps they should be, but they are important in allowing you to bring through ideas that you feel are really innovative.
Yeah.
And if you can find a bunch of people who can surround you with things that you don't have, and very often that's what I hire for initially, it's hire all the people who can do things incredibly well that I'm terrible at. Right? And I'm horrible at organization, I don't do lunch well, like there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? So part of it is that matrix organization of understanding, not necessarily, I believe in hierarchy, but finding ways to be complementary as well. When you think about organizations of different size, no matter what the size is, you're finding some way to make that work for you.
Yeah. I think the hardest thing to do too is, and it's with cost pressure and all that stuff, is giving people a little space to express themselves. I would love to have more opportunity to do that, and that's just really hard to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, and part of it, you know, to further it out, is it's one of those things where, you know, it's hiring the complementary team that fills in the pieces. But the other thing is, you know, since we're quoting people here, you know, Jeff Bezos said is like also hiring people that do the things you don't like to do, because it's unlikely that you really don't like doing something and you're awesome at it. You may be passive at it, but you're not awesome at it. And so part of it is when you put together that sort of Jenga board, you know, of like how it's going to fit together, it's getting people that are going to make you better because they want to do that thing. They want to love it. And that's hard to do. It's much easier said than done, but if you get it, it's magic.
Man, Jeff says some good stuff too, that the disagree and commit stuff from his latest letter, right? Again, that I think is the sign of a strong culture.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
When you're able to tell whoever you need to that that's stupid, but since we're agreed we're going to do it, let's get behind
let's
it.
do
It starts with leadership.
Let's get it done.
You got to have
Just get on
somebody
with it.
pushing it.
Exactly.
So.
Oh, that's great. So it looks like we're at time. I really want to thank all of you. This has been a great conversation. I took a lot away from it. I want to thank our audience, and for those of you that tuned into the live stream, I'd like to thank you as well. Clearly, there's a lot for us to think about here. It's a super complex industry on both sides. It's merging, coming together, this transition from linear to digital. But I think it's very reassuring that we have some incredibly smart people that are pushing themselves in the teams and their organizations and the industry to help solve for this. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what this future of TV looks like for all of us. So with that, thanks again.